Rancher lived alone for years until he pulled a weak Bigfoot from a deadly mud pit. After the war, Calvin Moore wanted nothing but silence. The forest gave him that until the day he heard a cry from the mud. He found a creature huge and dying, fighting for life. He could have walked away, but he didn't. With every pull of the rope he fought not the mud, but his own ghosts. When the creature's eyes met his, there was no fear, only trust. That night they shared fire warmth and something older than words, mercy. Days later it returned, not alone but with its kind. And Calvin realized he hadn't saved a beast. He'd saved a soul. Every fall since then he leaves a light by his porch. Because in the Wild West, kindness is the only fire that never dies. Before we begin, take a moment to comment the name of your city. Where are you watching from tonight? And when the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Oregon, 1978. The storm had passed, but the forest still breathed in mist and silence. Raindrops clung to pine needles, dripping slowly into the black soil. The world was quiet, too quiet, except for the steady rhythm of a man's boots crushing wet leaves. Calvin Moore. 56 walked with the slow caution of a man who'd seen too much war and too little peace. His cabin stood miles from the nearest road, a place chosen for its silence. But tonight that silence was broken. A sound rose from deep within the woods. Not a howl, not a man's cry. Something heavier, deeper, the kind of sound that comes from a chest full of fear and pain. Calvin froze, lantern trembling in his hand. "What in God's name is that?" he whispered. He followed the noise through the fog until his boots sank into soft mud. Then he saw it, a massive shape thrashing weakly in the pit, half buried, half alive. Thick fur slicked with rain, a face lifted just enough for him to see two eyes staring back. Not wild, not empty, but pleading. Calvin's grip tightened on the axe at his side. His breath came slow. Then he dropped the weapon, stepping closer to the edge. "Not this time," he murmured. Lightning flashed, a man and a monster, both trapped by the same kind of loneliness. Part 1. The Man Who Couldn't Walk Away. The morning came, pale and cold light dripping through the cracks of Calvin Moore's old wooden cabin. Smoke from the stove curled lazily upward, mixing with the scent of pine and damp earth. He sat at the small table by the window, same place he sat every morning for the last 10 years, staring at a photograph that had long lost its color. The frame was cracked, the glass smudged with dust. In it, 3 young men in uniform smiled proudly under a scorching foreign sun. Calvin was one of them, the only one still breathing. The war had ended decades ago, but the noise never left him. It lived in his chest, the echo of shouting, the whistle of shells, the silence that came after. That silence had followed him home and built itself into these walls. He never married, never had children. After the service, he'd sold what little he owned and moved to the edge of Oregon's endless woods. "A man can't hear ghosts out here," he'd once told a friend, but of course he could. The forest was full of them. On the mantel above the stove sat a row of medals, dull and forgotten under a film of dust. Beside them, an old Bible and a rusted compass, both keepsakes from the field. He hadn't touched them in years. They were relics of a man he no longer recognized. His only companion now was Scout, an old mutt with graying fur and slow eyes. The dog slept near the fire, occasionally lifting its head at the creak of floorboards or the sigh of wind through the chimney. Sometimes Calvin talked to him, not because he expected an answer, but because it reminded him his voice still worked. "Cold one today, huh, boy?" he muttered, pouring himself black coffee. The mug trembled slightly in his scarred hands. Scout thumped his tail once softly. Calvin stared out the window at the pines swaying under the morning fog. His mind wasn't on the forest, though. It was still trapped in the night before. That sound, that face, those eyes. He had seen plenty of things die in his life. Soldiers, animals, even the light in men's eyes when they realized the bullet was theirs. But last night was different. What he'd seen in that pit wasn't the blank stare of a dying beast. It was recognition, fear, maybe even a plea. He rubbed his temples, muttering under his breath, "You're losing it, old man." But the image refused to fade. The creature's arm had twitched weakly, its chest rising in uneven heaves, the mud swallowing it inch by inch. And those eyes, amber-wide human in a way he couldn't explain, stared right into him. He'd wanted to walk away. Every instinct said so. A man alone in the woods had no business meddling with something that size, that unknown. But something deeper, older, had rooted him in place. The same thing that made him drag wounded men out of gunfire, that made him keep digging graves long after the rain had drowned the trenches. That night, he hadn't slept. Every creak in the walls sounded like a breath from the forest. Every gust of wind carried that memory, the silent question in the creature's eyes. "Why are you leaving me here?" He set his mug down the clink sharp in the quiet cabin. His gaze drifted to the metals again. Bronze, silver, forgotten. They meant nothing now, not out here. But once they had stood for something. Duty, honor, courage. He looked back at the photograph, his thumb brushing over the faces of the men who never came home. They were his brothers, and he'd left them behind. A whisper escaped his throat, half prayer, half confession. "I couldn't save them." He paused, eyes glinting in the dull morning light. "But I can save this one." Scout lifted, his head ears twitching as Calvin stood and reached for his coat. His movements were slow, deliberate, not the hurried rush of panic, but the calm of a man who had already made his choice. Outside, the air bit with the chill of rain-soaked earth. Calvin loaded a coil of rope into the back of his truck, along with a lantern, a small first aid kit, and a flask of water. He glanced once toward the tree line, dark, thick, and waiting. For a long moment, he hesitated. The rational part of him whispered all the reasons to stay inside. It wasn't his problem, it wasn't his world, and maybe it wasn't even real. But there was another voice, softer, steadier, the one that had kept him alive through chaos. That voice said, "No one gets left behind." He shut the truck door, the sound echoing through the still morning. As he started down the muddy path, Scout barked once, then twice a sound that followed him into the trees. Calvin didn't look back. In his mind, the forest had already swallowed him whole. Part 2. The Pull from the Pit. The forest was darker that afternoon, clouds choking the sun and wind hissing through the tall pines. The air smelled of rain and rot, the kind of damp that seeps into the bones. Calvin Moore trudged through the mud rope coiled around his shoulder, his boots sinking with every step. He followed the trail he had marked the night before, though the forest already seemed to have swallowed it again. The sound reached him first, a faint labored groan followed by the wet suck of something moving in mud. His pulse quickened. It was still alive. He moved carefully toward the clearing, the same place where he had seen the creature half buried in the pit. When he broke through the brush, the sight froze him in place all over again. The Bigfoot was still there, chest deep in the sludge, struggling weakly. Its massive arms trembled as it tried to push upward, but every attempt only pulled it deeper. Mud clung to its fur like chains. Its breath came ragged, desperate. Calvin's military instincts kicked in assess plan act. He looped one end of the rope around a thick pine trunk, pulling tight until it held firm. The other end he fashioned into a wide loop. "All right," he muttered under his breath, voice low and steady. "One shot, old man. Don't screw it up." He took a deep breath, then inched closer to the pit, the ground slick beneath him. His boots slipped twice, spattering mud up to his knees. He threw the rope forward. It landed just short. The creature's head lifted weakly, its amber eyes locking onto him again. Not wild, not angry, just tired. Calvin gritted his teeth, pulled the rope back and threw again, this time closer. "Come on. Take it," he urged, his voice cracking from strain. The creature's massive arm shifted, slow and shaking. For a moment, Calvin thought it wouldn't move at all. Then, with a weak groan, it reached out thick fingers, closing clumsily around the rope. That's it, Calvin whispered. He dug his boots into the dirt, wrapped the rope around his waist for leverage, and began to pull. The first few feet didn't budge. The weight was enormous, the suction of the mud unrelenting. The rope burned through his palms, slicing open old scars. He grunted, pulled harder, muscles screaming. The mud gurgled in protest, but slowly, Painfully, the creature began to rise. "Come on, damn it!" Calvin growled, his whole body shaking from the effort. He could feel his heart pounding in his ears, his breath coming in ragged bursts. For a second, the rope slipped, sending him stumbling forward, knees slamming into the wet ground. He caught himself, hands slick with blood and mud, and reset his grip. Another pull, another inch, another gasp. The creature's chest broke the surface, then its shoulders. A sound escaped it, not a roar, but a low guttural moan of exhaustion. Almost there, Calvin yelled over the wind. He leaned back with every ounce of strength left in his body, every tendon and memory of discipline from his years in the field. The rope creaked, the mud slurped, and finally, with one last heave, the weight gave way. The Bigfoot's body slid free, collapsing onto the dry patch of ground beside the pit with a heavy, wet thud. Calvin fell backward, landing hard on his elbows. His chest heaved, lungs burning. For a long moment, neither of them moved, two broken creatures sprawled in the mud, gasping in rhythm with the wind. When he finally lifted his head, he saw the Bigfoot lying motionless. Its fur was plastered with mud, its breathing shallow but steady. He crawled closer, still cautious eyes, scanning for any sign of aggression. But there was none. The creature's massive chest rose and fell slowly. Its arm twitched, not in threat, but in exhaustion. Calvin stayed a few feet away, unsure what to do next. He wiped the blood from his palms, staring at the rope marks carved into his skin. Then the creature turned its head slightly, just enough for their eyes to meet again. For a long, silent second, time stopped. There was no roar, no fear, no violence, only the faint shimmer of something human reflected in those eyes, confusion, pain, and gratitude. Calvin's throat tightened, his breath trembled. "Easy now," he said softly, voice barely above a whisper. "You're all right." The Bigfoot blinked once, then exhaled a deep, shuddering breath that carried the weight of both exhaustion and relief. Calvin sank to his knees beside it. He wanted to say something more, anything, but words felt too small for what had just happened. Instead, he sat there in the cold mud, staring at the creature he'd just pulled from death. Above them, the clouds began to thin, letting a faint shaft of light fall through the mist. It landed across the Bigfoot's face, turning the slick mud into a dull bronze glow. Calvin looked up, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his lips. "Guess we both made it out of the mud," he murmured. He didn't know why he'd done it. Maybe it was duty. Maybe it was redemption. Maybe it was something simpler, the refusal to walk away one more time. Whatever it was, it had changed something in him. The soldier who once buried his brothers under foreign skies now knelt beside a myth, and for the first time in years, his heart didn't feel so heavy. The wind eased. The forest fell silent again. And in that silence, muddy, raw, and human Calvin Moore finally let himself breathe. Part 3. The Fire and the Eyes. By dusk, the forest had changed again. The wind had gone still, and a mist rolled low across the ferns. Everything smelled of wet bark and smoke, the kind of scent that clings to memory. Calvin Moore knelt beside a small fire, coaxing the flame to life. The wood hissed softly as the first sparks caught spreading light across the clearing. His hands were still raw and torn from the rope, but he barely noticed. He worked with the calm precision of a man who'd done this 1,000 times, a soldier's rhythm simple and sure. A few feet away, the creature lay against a fallen log, its massive chest rising and falling in slow, labored rhythm. The mud had dried in thick patches along its fur, leaving dark streaks that cracked as it breathed. Each movement sent a faint tremor through its frame, but it was alive. Calvin reached for his canteen, filled it from a nearby puddle, then set it close to the fire. He broke a piece of hard bread and laid it beside the canteen, a peace offering. "Here," he said quietly, his voice rough but steady. "It's not much, but it'll do." The creature didn't move at first. Its head hung low, face hidden in the shadow. Then slowly its massive hand twitched. Fingers like the roots of an old tree reached forward, hesitating just above the food. Calvin stayed still. No sudden movements. No words. When the creature finally reached the bread, it moved carefully, clumsily, as if unsure of its own strength. The bread broke between its fingers. It brought a piece to its mouth and chewed slowly, deliberately. The sound, soft and real, seemed to echo louder than the crackle of fire. Calvin exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. "There you go," he murmured. "You're safe here." The Bigfoot's head lifted slightly, just enough for the firelight to catch its eyes. Amber, deep, intelligent, not wild, not empty, but watching him, truly watching. For a long time neither moved. The only sound was the pop of resin in the fire and the faint drip of rain from the leaves. Calvin could feel the weight of the moment settling over him, the kind of silence that carried meaning instead of fear. He had sat like this before in a dozen battlefields, long forgotten, sharing fires with men who couldn't speak his language, trading nods that meant more than words ever could. It was the same, now two creatures breathing in rhythm, bound by survival, and something quieter, understanding. The creature's breathing steadied. It shifted its weight slightly, the firelight brushing across the rough texture of its fur. Calvin noticed scars, long pale ridges across its arm, the kind only made by claws or bullets. This wasn't the first time it had fought for its life. "Guess we've both seen too much of that," he whispered. The Bigfoot's eyes flickered toward him, a brief, curious glance, as if it understood tone if not words. Calvin leaned back on his elbows, watching the fire dance between them. His body ached, but the exhaustion was sweet. For once he wasn't running from the noise in his head. The forest had quieted too. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. He broke another piece of bread this time, setting it closer. The creature hesitated, then reached again, slower, calmer. Its hand brushed the dirt near his boot. The touch wasn't intentional, just proximity, but it sent a jolt through him all the same. He looked up, and for the first time the Bigfoot didn't look away. They simply stared at each other, two silhouettes framed by the flame. In those seconds, everything fell away, the years of solitude, the metals collecting dust, the ghosts of men he couldn't save. All that remained was this strange, wordless bond born from pain and mercy. The creature blinked once, a slow, heavy motion. Then it lowered its head again, curling its arms loosely around its chest. Its breathing slowed into the rhythm of rest. Calvin shifted closer to the fire, adding another log. The flames rose higher, painting the clearing in gold. His reflection wavered in the creature's eyes like a memory half-remembered. He thought of the Bible verse his mother used to whisper before bed, something about the Good Shepherd and the one lost sheep. He never believed much in sermons, but sitting here watching this wounded giant rest in the glow of his fire, he understood the meaning for the first time. It wasn't about faith. It was about choice, about the simple, stubborn decision to care, even when the world said not to. Calvin rubbed a hand over his face and chuckled softly to himself. "Hell," he muttered, "maybe that's all saving ever was." The creature stirred, exhaled a low sound. Not a growl, but something like a sigh. Calvin smiled faintly. "Yeah, you get it." The fire crackled louder, casting shadows that danced across the trees like moving ghosts. Above them, the mist began to lift. The moon, half hidden, cut a pale line through the smoke. Two shapes, man and myth, sat together under the pines, breathing the same air, sharing the same warmth. No words, no fear, only the fragile peace that comes after survival. And for the first time in decades, Calvin Moore didn't feel alone. Part 4. The Return to the Woods. The night had a strange stillness to it, the kind that made even the forest hold its breath. A pale moon hung low above the pines, washing the clearing in silver light. The air smelled of smoke and pine resin, faint traces of the fire that had burned out hours earlier. Inside his cabin, Calvin Moore sat in silence. His axe leaned against the wall, his boots still muddy from the day's work. Scout snored softly by the hearth. The quiet was comforting, until it wasn't. Then came the sound, heavy, slow, deliberate, thud, 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 the same rhythm that had haunted the edges of his dreams since that day by the pit. Scout lifted his head and growled low in his throat. Calvin froze his hand, hovering near the lantern. The steps grew louder, not frantic or wild, but steady, almost measured. He rose from his chair, his joints creaking as he reached for the door. The moment he opened it, the world seemed to stop. There it was, standing just beyond the porch, bathed in the silver wash of moonlight. The creature, no longer caked in mud or trembling from exhaustion. Its fur, dark and thick, shimmered faintly in the cold air. Its breath formed clouds that drifted upward like smoke. It was taller than he remembered, stronger, restored. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Only the night wind whispered between the trees. Calvin's first instinct was fear, the old pulse of survival thudding in his chest. But it passed as quickly as it came. The creature's eyes met his calm and knowing, carrying the same quiet awareness he'd seen by the fire. He raised the lantern slightly. "You came back," he murmured almost to himself. The Bigfoot tilted its head, then lifted one massive hand. It didn't reach out. It pointed toward the woods, a gesture, a summons. Calvin hesitated. His life had been built on discipline, on logic. But logic had no place here, not tonight. Something older guided him, the same voice that had told him not to walk away from that pit. He nodded once, a silent agreement. "All right, then," he whispered. "Lead the way." He grabbed his coat, took the lantern, and stepped off the porch. Scout barked once behind him, but Calvin waved him off. "Stay, boy." The Bigfoot turned and began to walk, its long stride silent despite its weight. Calvin followed, boots crunching softly against the frosted ground. The forest swallowed them quickly, branches closing overhead like curtains. They moved deeper and deeper into the dark, guided only by the faint golden glow of the lantern and the soft gleam of moonlight on wet leaves. Calvin's heart pounded, not with fear, but anticipation. The air grew colder, heavier. The forest around him seemed alive, watching, listening. Every now and then, the creature glanced back, making sure he was still there. Finally, the trees parted into a wide clearing he had never seen before. The moon shone bright here, spilling light across the moss and stone. And that's when he saw them. Shapes. Huge, silent shapes moving just beyond the edge of the light. 1, 2, then 5, no 6. Massive figures, taller and broader than the one he'd saved, their fur glinting like obsidian in the moonlight. Calvin's breath caught. His hand tightened on the lantern handle. They stood in a half-circle, motionless, watching him. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the firelight like amber glass. No growls, no howls, no aggression, only stillness. The Bigfoot he'd rescued stepped forward into the center of the clearing. It turned to face him, then lowered its head, a slow, deliberate bow. Calvin swallowed hard. He felt something in his chest twist, not fear, not pride, but something deeper. Recognition. The creature was not a beast to be tamed. It was a being, ancient, aware, protective. Then one of the larger figures, broader, older-looking, stepped closer. The ground trembled faintly beneath its steps. It stopped just short of the firelight. For a moment, Calvin thought it might attack. Instead, it lifted its massive hand and placed it briefly on the shoulder of the one he'd saved. A gesture of kinship, of approval. Then the elder turned to him. Its eyes locked on his, and Calvin felt the same calm weight settle over him again. No words were spoken. None were needed. He understood. They knew. They knew what he had done, and they remembered. The Bigfoot he'd rescued took one last step forward, its gaze softer now, almost human. Then it nodded, a single solemn motion that carried more meaning than any language could hold. Calvin's throat tightened. He gave a small nod in return. "Go on," he said quietly, voice trembling. "You're home now." The creature turned and disappeared into the mist, followed by the others. Their silhouettes melted into the forest until the clearing was empty again. Only the whisper of wind remained and the faint echo of something sacred passing between worlds. Calvin stood there for a long time, lantern dimming in his hand. The forest no longer felt empty. It felt alive, aware, as if it had just shared its oldest secret. He took a deep breath, the cold air burning his lungs, and whispered to the night, "Thank you." Then he turned back toward his cabin, walking slowly, the moonlight at his back. Part 5. The Silent Truth. Morning came softly, the kind of morning that carried no wind, no bird calls, only light. The storm had passed, and the forest, bathed in pale gold, seemed reborn. Thin rays of sunlight slipped through the cracks in Calvin's old cabin walls, brushing over dust-worn floorboards and the quiet breathing of the dog at his feet. For the first time in a long time, Calvin didn't wake with a soldier's tension in his chest. No nightmares, no half-remembered shouts from another life. Just stillness. He sat by the small table, a steaming mug of black coffee beside him, and pulled open an old drawer. Inside was a faded leather-bound notebook, its corners curled, the edges darkened with time. He flipped it open to a clean page, the pen trembling faintly in his hand. The smell of pine drifted through the window as he began to write. March the 2nd. The forest was alive last night. He paused, staring at the words. They looked too small for what he had seen, too fragile to hold something so big. But he kept going. I found them. Or maybe they found me. They weren't monsters, not beasts. They were family, a people who hide because they must. I don't know what they saw in me, but I'll remember what I saw in them. Mercy. The pen scratched quietly each word. Steady. Deliberate. He wrote about the mud pit, the weight of the rope, the firelight, and the eyes that watched him without hate. He wrote about the clearing, the silent circle of giants, and the bow, that wordless exchange that said everything. When he finished, Calvin set the pen down and stared at the page. His reflection flickered in the glass of the cabin window, older lined, but somehow softer. He closed the notebook gently and slid it into the bottom drawer beneath an old folded map and a handful of medals that hadn't seen daylight in decades. Some things he thought weren't meant to be told. Not because they were unbelievable, but because they were sacred. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. Some truths, he said aloud, voice low and gravelly, aren't meant to be shouted. Just remembered, quietly. Scout lifted his head-tail, thumping weakly against the floor. Calvin smiled. Yeah, boy. Quiet's all we ever needed. He stood, stretching his stiff shoulders, and walked to the porch. The boards creaked under his boots. The same sound he'd heard for years. Yet today, it didn't feel lonely. The forest spread before him, shimmering with dew. Shafts of light pierced through the trees, turning the air into gold. For a moment, Calvin thought he saw a shape between the trunks, tall, still watching. But when he blinked, it was gone. He didn't move, didn't need to. Some part of him knew it was real, that they were still out there, and that was enough. He breathed in deeply, the crisp air filling his lungs, carrying the faint scent of moss and smoke. The same forest that once held only silence now felt alive with unseen presence. For years, Calvin Moore had lived as a ghost among trees, a man haunted by the things he couldn't save. But in saving something no one believed existed, he'd somehow saved himself. The guilt was lighter now, the loneliness quieter. He sat down on the porch steps, setting his mug beside him. Scout laid his head on his knee. The sun climbed higher, scattering the mist into ribbons of light. Calvin smiled faintly. We're not so alone after all, are we? The forest didn't answer. It didn't need to. Sometimes silence said everything. Years passed, and the cabin aged with its owner. The wood darkened, the roof sagged, but the light on the porch never failed. Calvin Moore, now gray and slow in his steps, sat on that same porch wrapped in a heavy coat. Scout, older still, lay quietly beside him. The forest around them was calm, only the whisper of leaves and the hum of distant wind. On the steps before him sat three things: a folded blanket, a bucket of clean water, and a lantern glowing softly in the dusk. His voice, low and steady, broke the silence. Every fall before the first frost I leave a blanket, a bucket of water, and a light for a friend. For a long while there was only the wind. Then from deep within the trees came a single soft knock. Once, then twice. Calvin smiled, eyes glistening beneath the lantern light. He didn't turn his head. He didn't need to. Welcome home, he whispered. In the Wild West, kindness is the only fire that never dies. Bigfoot was never the monster, only the reflection of our own humanity. If this story touched your heart, leave a little fire emoji in the comments so we'll know the kindness in you is still burning. This is Rancher Wild West Stories, where every lonely night hides a story that might just save a soul.